This is Compound Insights, a podcast by CFA Society New York. I'm Rob Rowan. Today we're talking about modern monetary theory, or MMT. I think this is an important topic because it has been very present in the mainstream media and also on lots of your clients' minds. It calls into question the uses of some of the metrics that CFAs learn and analysts use. And the information about it on the internet is confusing and has lots of political noise. Trust me, I went down that rabbit hole yesterday and do not recommend it. Now, today on the podcast, we have a real expert. Paul Sheard is a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. He was vice chairman of S&P Global and held chief economist positions at Nomura, Lehman Brothers, and was head of Japanese equity investments at Baring. He has been a lecturer at Australian National University, Osaka University, and Stanford. He has served on councils for the World Economic Forum, is a member of the Bretton Woods Committee, and was appointed to positions in the Japanese government by not one but two prime ministers. I'll leave it there, but to encourage you to read Paul's bio on our website because I left out many details of his impressive career. So, Paul, I'd like to start with a short introduction of a simple definition of modern monetary theory.
Well, thanks very much, Rob. I think the key insight from MMT is really around the creation of money. And if you, in a nutshell, we're used to thinking about the government having to go out and raise money in order to spend money, and therefore facing those kind of fiscal constraints. MMT kind of turns that concept on its head and points out that really, if you go under the current institutional framework and dig a little bit deeper, you see that governments actually are one of the vehicles in society that creates money. In other words, governments create money when they run a budget deficit. A lot of things happen after that, but it's basically this sort of butting of heads between the mainstream view that there are fiscal constraints, the government might run out of money, versus MMT that says, well, hold on a minute, actually governments create money, so it's not necessarily the constraint that we thought it was.
Okay, so one of the things that I think is interesting about this is that spending equals income, and no spending equals no income in one of the adherents that I read about it. Do you also think that it is fair to say that governments do not need taxes or to issue bonds to spend money?
They don't. And one of the reasons that we sort of come to understand that process a little bit more is through the quantitative easing that has taken place around the world. It started in Japan back in 2001 to 2006 in the modern era. That was where I came into contact with it because I was based in Japan at the time. But of course, after the financial crisis, QE went big across the Fed, the Bank of England, the ECB, and then the Bank of Japan chimed in again. So under the current institutional framework that we have, which the modern conventional policy framework with a fairly strict separation of monetary policy from fiscal policy, and central banks essentially being given the job of managing the macroeconomic targets, full employment, price stability, then it is the case that governments have to go out and issue bonds to raise money, to spend the money. What MMT points out is that that's a product of a particular institutional framework. It's there for a reason, but it's not God-given. And if you think of QE, for example, imagine if the central bank just accommodated all of the budget deficits that the government is running with QE. That's essentially a situation where you don't need any bond issuance. You still create money, but that money resides in the system in a different form.
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the interesting examples of this is the U.S. So the U.S. federal government has been in deficit for years and has flirted with creating legislation over most of those years that would require it to balance its budget at some point.
Mm.
In my research for this, I did read a little bit about something that President Nixon said when the government went into deficit that year. He said, I guess we're all Keynesians now. Didn't get a chance to act on that because he was impeached shortly after that.
That's a very bad idea, by the way, this idea of sort of fiscal soundness or probity that governments, should be running a balanced budget, and somehow if they veer away from that in the direction of running a deficit, somehow they're doing something a little bit naughty. That's sort of conflating, and I don't think MMT has a monopoly on this insight, but is conflating sort of individual households and corporations and the budget constraints that they face with the government, which is essentially a collective action vehicle on behalf of the whole of society. And governments, there are very good reasons, actually, for governments to run budget deficits.
So one of the other things that I thought was interesting is MMT does point out in a way that and some investors who follow this pattern have profited greatly from, is that default is a policy decision. Default is not a de facto idea that we don't have money to service the bonds. It's a policy decision.
Yes, and I think that we do need to bear a distinction in, and maybe you'll come to this, between which governments are we talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
I think
True,
the insights from MMT are most applicable, Rob, when we're talking about mature, developed economies where the governments are able to run budget deficits and issue bonds in their own currency.
Right.
And in a sense, that's saying that society, the public, has confidence in the government. In many emerging markets, that's not the case, and they essentially have to finance themselves in dollars. And of course, if you're an emerging market government, you don't have a printing press that will instantly create dollars. So this discussion, we really want to focus more on what's the case with developing economies. And if you look at the default situation, some developed market economies, they do default, but most of the defaults happen in emerging market space where they do not have access to a dollar printing press.
True, so that's a good point. So we are talking about mature economies with fiat currencies who have issued virtually all of their debt in their own currency. And most of them right now have relatively low inflation rates, and despite their trying to not have that anymore. Most of them tried to reflate, and it hasn't really worked.
Correct.
So what are the main criticisms, and I saw a lot of them on the internet, of MMT from an economist's perspective?
Well, actually, I think when we talk about criticisms, it's probably better to start with the criticisms that MMT has of the mainstream,
enough,
in
yeah.
a sense.
Yeah.
There's an interesting sort of economic history or history of economic thought story to be told by somebody at some point. Because MMT, or at least its antecedents, have been around for a long time. So, economists have been arguing about monetary and fiscal matters for literally, at least 100 years, but even longer than that. And Keynes, Friedman, Hayek,
Right.
Rational Expectations, Lucas,
Yes, okay.
etc. And so there's a lot of controversies in the field. But MMT kind of developed out of a couple of strands. One, I would say, is sort of the endogenous money idea. So in a lot of textbook economics, the money supply is treated as being exogenous, and it's something that the central bank can control, and that has an effect on the economy. That's really not very descriptively correct, and these sort of heterodox economists in MMT for decades, or New Keynesians in some cases, pointed out that actually money is endogenous through a couple of vehicles. One is through governments running budget deficits, and also the other one, of course, is bank credit creation. Banks create money when they lend.
Right.
And so that has to be taken into account. So that's one of the criticisms of the MMT, if you like, of the mainstream. I think another one would be, at least a feature of MMT that I'm quite attracted to myself, is that it's rooted in sort of balance sheets and the actual sort of monetary and fiscal mechanics, the sort of plumbing of the fiscal and monetary system. Whereas the typical sort of mainstream textbook economic treatment is very high-level abstract, sort of demand and supply curves, ISLM, aggregate demand, aggregate supply. And it's not really rooted in sort of how institutions actually operate. And I actually think a lot of the criticisms now from the mainstream back to MMT sort of are based on a bit of a misunderstanding, almost that the two camps are talking past one another. But one of the criticisms is, I think, that these MMT people are kind of naive, they don't understand. They think that the governments can run deficits endlessly and finance Green New Deals and all sorts of things, and it's not like that. So I think that is actually a misunderstanding of what MMT is saying. I think MMT, the key insight for me is that it's more of one of the earlier strands was Abba Lerner, functional finance, the idea that fiscal and monetary policy are there to serve the good of society, to achieve full employment, to control inflation. They shouldn't be an end in themselves. They're more a means to an end. Whereas in the modern world, again, with this framework, we have separation of fiscal and monetary policy, sort of aggregate demand management being given primarily to this independent technocratic central bank. That's sort of taken on a bit of a life of its own.
Okay.
And as sort of we've, I think, kind of haven't quite realized that these things are not God-given, and maybe there's a good idea to loosen some of those constraints in the service of making sure that we're at full employment. We are controlling the macroeconomy in the best way we can.
Yeah, I mean, this was one of the things that I definitely read out there was a lot of the criticism of MMT to the degree that it could create hyperinflation. We're a little tone deaf to, once again, the fact that most developed sovereign governments have tried to improve and raise inflation and have not been able to. And that inflation rates are generally exceptionally low. So even if some of these policies did result in higher inflation, they would be intervenable at that stage because they're already so low. It would happen before that. One of the issues that I saw was that some of the MMT people say that one of the ways to control inflation is through raising taxes. And I wonder if that is one of the macroeconomic factors that you hear from MMT people.
Yeah, I think that's a key idea that. What is the role of taxes in the normal framework? Understanding is, well, governments need tax revenue in order to raise the money to spend, and if they don't raise enough tax revenue, then they have to raise that money by issuing bonds.
Right.
Again, I think that one of the key insights of MMT is, hold on, just go back to basics here. I call this the monetary Garden of Eden. I invented this term, which is a world in which there's no separation of monetary and fiscal policy. We just have one government, and this is an important point, by the way. These independent central banks are part of the consolidated government. So just think of one government, there's no distinction. And they're running a budget deficit. What they're really doing is creating government money, what would be, think of central bank reserves or central bank money, right. The stuff that is the raw material of quantitative easing. I think the right way to think about this, really sort of first principles, is a government that is running a budget deficit. It's essentially injecting net purchasing power into the economy. It's spending more money than it's raising. And what's left over, which would be bank deposits, which have as their counterpart central bank reserves, and sort of central bank money or consolidated government money, is what is there. Now, the problem with that is, how do you run a monetary system on that basis? Fast forward now to the sort of framework we have now. So you could see in that system, as long as the public were prepared to accept the social security checks and the other payments coming from the government, there wouldn't be any constraint, a taxation constraint on government spending.
Right.
But what's happening in the monetary world? What's happening to interest rates? What's happening to economic activity? What's happening to inflation? So you separate the central government, the government from the central bank at that point, and say, okay, we're going to put handcuffs on the fiscal authority and make them issue bonds or raise taxes. That then becomes the means by which they get their funding. And then the central bank is essentially through open market operations, buying or selling those bonds, determining the optimal level of reserves in the banking system. Hope I'm not getting too technical here, but essentially what happens is that we've created a framework where macroeconomic or monetary control is exercised through the interest rate channel of central banks.
Right.
And we're sort of pretending that governments have to raise taxes and issue bonds to get their hands on the money. Another way of thinking about it or doing it would be to say, actually, let's think of taxes as the vehicle by which we withdraw purchasing power from the economy.
Okay.
So if we create too much money net, or if you like, inject too much net purchasing power into the economy, we're going to have an overheating economy.
Right.
So let's think about how you would use fiscal policy to control that. One way would be to turn up the tax dial. So it's not that taxes don't have a role in the MMT kind of conception. It's that it's quite a different kind of role from the conventional kind of way of looking at things.
Okay. And I think I heard something in there, something I read you say many times before, that MMT is a lens for thinking about these types of issues rather than necessarily a specific theory. And I think I heard you just say that about this is a way of viewing the taxation issue. What other areas of the marketplace, or the plumbing, as it were, are important to look at with this type of lens?
Well, I think we've mentioned QE a few times. I think that that's an important sort of, if you like, touch point between the fiscal and the monetary.
Right.
And people often point out, well, it sort of blurs fiscal and monetary policy. In a sense, it does, because I mentioned the monetary Garden of Eden a moment ago. If you think of QE, what QE is I never tire of pointing this out because people don't seem to really understand this point. Quantitative easing is really best thought of as a debt refinancing operation of the consolidated government.
A debt refinancing.
Let
me unpack that for a second. A debt refinancing.
What that means is that think of the consolidated government as the central bank and the treasury together, and it changes its debt structure. I mean, CFA holders are very used to thinking about Miller-Modigliani theorems and capital structure.
Right.
Well, think of that with the government. And so what the consolidated government does is retire long-term government debt securities and refinances them into central bank money or central bank reserves. And the exit from QE is just reversing that process. So central bank money and government debt securities in that world are really interchangeable. They're just two different debt instruments of the central bank. However, so you might say, well, what's the point? Economists and central bank watchers talk about the portfolio rebalance effect and all that sort of stuff. But I think the really key insight for me, Rob, as I thought through all of this over a number of years, was that, well, there's a key difference between government debt securities and central bank money. And that key difference is central bank money never needs to be repaid.
Right.
Whereas long-term debt securities have a pay-by date attached to them.
Right.
But what it tells you is, from this MMT perspective, there are sort of two ways of the government financing itself. One way is a way that makes it look like the government can run out of money.
Right.
It's beholden to the financial markets.
Right.
Because its debt will come due and maybe it won't be refinanced. But there's another way, which is you actually do away with that constraint, which would be creating central bank money. Now, again, in the past, there's been good reasons not to do it that way. That would lead to, too much expenditure, too much money printing, too much inflation. But we're in a different world now, where people are worrying about, is there enough policy ammunition, secular stagnation, low R star?
Right.
And I think that's where the MMT insights come in and actually bring some good news, which is you don't have to worry about these constraints. You can loosen them to achieve social welfare gains of full employment, etc. So I think, to me, the biggest implications of MMT are the policy implications that it brings in the particular circumstances that everybody is worrying about at the moment, which is running out of monetary policy bullets and limited fiscal space.
Right, and that's one of the things that has been astounding to me over the last year, is how MMT has risen in the blogosphere and on TV, et cetera, and now in the current campaign for the next presidency. One of Bernie Sanders' appointees to his campaign is a very serious MMT proponent. So what other types of things we talked about the ECB in its helicopter, not specifically, but QE money. And there is a growing concern about the capability of the government, or where the government's role should be, in social spending, which has been bouncing around between austerity and not for some time. There is also, I saw an interesting series of clips on this from back in the 90s when we had a balanced budget, but that was also the first time that the federal government had forecasted that Social Security would run out of money someday. The Social Security Trust, I should say. Then we have globally slower growth, negative yielding debt, so a couple other things that are on people's minds, Brexit. So are there other reasons that you see that this has reached such a level of consciousness that perhaps other areas of economics have not?
Well, there's a lot in that question there that you packed in, Rob. But I think what's happened, over the last 10 years since the financial crisis and the Great Recession is, a number of things have sort of happened that we've got used to. One is QE, and we're now sort of very used to that. And QE doesn't really fit into that pre-MMT conventional framework as well as it fits into a more MMT way of thinking about the world.
Okay.
And then we have this the secular stagnation, low R-star kind of issue. And, everybody's now worrying about what will monetary policy, will policymakers have enough ammunition in the next downturn? And now more conventional, famous mainstream economists like Olivier Blanchard, Larry Summers, Paul Krugman and others are sort of leaning to the view that, we don't have to worry about fiscal constraints as much as we did in the past. We're able to now spend more money. So I think MMT kind of gives more of a thumbs up to that point of view. But what's interesting, I think, looking at this, you mentioned the Bernie Sanders campaign, and you might be referring to Stephanie Kelton.
Yes,
she was actually an advisor to the 2016 Bernie Sanders campaign.
Oh, she was. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that sort of may have been the trigger for MMT to come into the mainstream consciousness. But it's sort of, and this may be part of the problem, that is why the two sides have sort of got their pitchforks out, is that normally what you have with economics is sort of economic theory develops. You have the theory, you have the models, you have the theoretical academic understanding. That then starts to influence policy options and policy ideas. And then it goes into the political realm. Politicians then have got a menu of policies at their disposal. So it sort of goes from academic learning, policy prescriptions to political choices. What's happened with MMT, it seems to me, is it's sort of come into the public consciousness through the reverse route.
Oh, okay.
That it wasn't really on the radar screen of the mainstream academic economists, and therefore it wasn't really directly influencing policy. But suddenly the meme starts to come in through the political realm.
Okay.
Particularly sort of from the left. Now, I don't think it's a left or a right idea. I think it's just an idea. But it's come in through the political realm, now then starts to have purported policy implications, and then the academic world is reacting to it. So I think that's sort of part of the confusion here.
Perhaps we should leave it there. This has been great. I hope this gives the CFAs who listen to this a chance to reflect on it and be prepared for listening into their clients. So thank you, Paul.
It was a pleasure, Rob.
And thank you for listening into Compound Insights by CFA Society New York. You can find other episodes on our website at cfany.org and soon on many other podcast apps.